The 11-year-old girl sat quietly in seat 16A, headphones resting snugly over her ears, her head tilted slightly toward the window, as if the endless stretch of clouds outside were a lullaby meant only for her eyes closed in the deep, effortless sleep of a child who had spent the morning waking up too early and the afternoon pretending not to be tired, and to everyone else on the flight she was invisible in the most ordinary way possible, just another young passenger tucked between strangers, another small figure on a long haul flight where people were busy with their own thoughts, their own destinations, their own worries, her sneakers barely touching the floor, her hands folded loosely in her lap, while beside her her father sat upright with a book open, turning pages slowly, occasionally glancing at her with the quiet protectiveness of a parent who feels at peace knowing his child is safe. The cabin bathed in soft, dimmed lighting that signaled cruising altitude. Overhead bins closed, seatbelt signs off, the low, constant hum of the engines creating a rhythm that blended with the muted clinks of ice in plastic cups and the distant footsteps of flight attendants moving calmly down the aisle. And outside the small oval windows the sky stretched endlessly, layers of white clouds glowing faintly under the sun, giving the illusion that the plane was floating rather than flying, and for a while nothing felt unusual at all. No alarms, no raised voices, no signs that this flight would be remembered for anything other than its departure and arrival times, passengers scrolling on their phones, some sleeping, some staring blankly ahead, all trusting the invisible hands in the cockpit to guide them safely across thousands of feet of open air. Until without warning a sudden jolt ripped through the aircraft, sharp and violent enough to snap people out of their routines, coffee sloshing over cup rims, trays rattling, a few startled gasps cutting through the hum of the engines, the girl's head shifting slightly against the seat as the turbulence surged, eyes fluttering but not yet opening, her father's hand instinctively reaching toward her arm, the plane dipping just enough to make stomachs lurch, followed by an uneasy silence as the aircraft steadied itself again, the engines adjusting their pitch in a way frequent flyers could sense but not explain, and though the seatbelt sign remained off, tension crept into the cabin like a cold draft, subtle but unmistakable, people exchanging quick looks with seatmates, brows furrowing, whispers beginning to ripple from row to row, the kind of whispers that carry more fear than words, because something felt different this time, not the usual bumps pilots brushed off as a little turbulence, but something heavier, something that lingered after the shaking stopped, and in the cockpit, unseen by the passengers, warning lights flickered, instruments demanded attention, voices lowered and sharpened with urgency, and while the plane continued forward through the sky, steady on the outside, inside it carried the weight of a problem that could not be ignored. Minutes passing in uneasy quiet as flight attendants paused their service, exchanging looks that were professional but tight, their smiles thinner than before, and then the intercom crackled softly, a sound that immediately drew every passenger's attention, conversation stopping mid-sentence, headphones being adjusted, eyes lifting toward the ceiling speakers, and the captain's voice came through, calm and controlled, yet carrying an edge that seasoned travelers recognized as carefully measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing just long enough for hearts to beat faster, "we're currently assessing a technical situation in the cockpit." And at those words a hush fell over the cabin, parents sitting straighter, hands tightening around armrests, passengers unconsciously holding their breath, and then, after another brief pause that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually did, he continued, his tone still steady but unmistakably urgent, "We may require assistance." A phrase that sent a ripple of unease through the rows, because assistance was not something captains usually asked for over a public address system, and then came the sentence that changed everything, the words that did not belong on a commercial flight announcement, the words that caused disbelief to flash across faces and murmurs to rise instantly. "Is there any fighter pilot on board?" And for a moment the cabin existed in suspended disbelief, passengers glancing up and down the aisle, eyes searching for someone, anyone who might stand up, half expecting a uniformed hero to appear from nowhere, laughter bubbling nervously from a few seats before dying out when no one moved, the the question hanging heavy in the air like an unanswered call, and in seat 16A, as the echoes of Captain's words settled into the cabin, the sleeping girl finally stirred, her fingers twitching slightly as if her mind had heard something important even before her eyes opened, unaware that in that very moment, while the cabin froze in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the air itself had decided to stop moving, and for a brief, suspended moment no one spoke, no one shifted in their seat, no one even seemed to breathe properly, because the words that had just echoed through the speakers did not belong to a commercial airplane filled with ordinary travelers heading to ordinary destinations, and faces turned slowly from side to side in pure disbelief, eyes scanning rows of strangers with the same unspoken question forming in every mind. A fighter pilot on this flight? As if the captain had asked whether a myth or a legend might be quietly sitting among them, someone trained for supersonic speeds and combat maneuvers, not cramped economy seats and plastic tray tables, and a few passengers let out short, nervous laughs that died almost immediately when reality settled in and no one rose, no confident figure stepping into the aisle, no calm voice saying, "I can't help." Only silence stretching longer and heavier with each passing second, seconds that felt like minutes as the weight of altitude and uncertainty pressed down on everyone at once. The hum of the engines, suddenly louder, more intrusive, people gripping armrests, parents instinctively drawing children closer, some passengers already whispering prayers under their breath, while others stared straight ahead, afraid that moving might somehow make things worse, and somewhere toward the back of the plane a phone camera clicked on, not out of excitement but out of fear, the human instinct to document moments when control feels like it's slipping away, and then the intercom crackled again, sharper this time, breaking the silence like glass, the captain repeating the request with the same calm tone, but now stripped of any room for doubt. "If there is any fighter pilot on board, please identify yourself." And the finality of his voice sent a chill through the cabin, because repetition meant necessity, and necessity meant the situation was serious, and still no one stood, no one moved, the aisle remaining empty except for the faint sway of the plane itself, until in seat 16A something shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, the girl's eyelids fluttering open as if she had surfaced from a deep, peaceful dream into a world that suddenly felt tense and sharp, her headphones still playing soft music that now sounded distant and irrelevant as her eyes adjusted to the dim cabin lights and the unfamiliar expressions on the faces around her, confusion crossing her features for a brief second before awareness settled in. The kind of awareness that didn't belong to a child just waking up, but to someone who understood exactly what those words meant, and she reached up slowly, deliberately, sliding the headphones off her ears and letting them rest against her neck as the low murmur of the cabin rushed in to replace the music, whispers, shaky breaths, the faint tremor of fear, and she turned her head toward her father, who had closed his book without realizing it, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead but his jaw tight, as if he were weighing a decision he had hoped would never come, and in a voice so calm it contrasted sharply with the tension around them, she spoke softly, "Dad, they're asking for a fighter pilot." Her words barely louder than a whisper, yet clear enough to cut through the moment, and her father looked at her then, really looked at her, meeting her eyes in a way that carried years of unspoken understanding, memories of early mornings, quiet training sessions, promises made and boundaries carefully drawn, and for a heartbeat he hesitated, the instincts of a parent clashing with the reality of the situation, his fingers tightening around the edge of the book as if holding on to normalcy, and around them the cabin remained unaware, passengers still scanning faces, still waiting for an adult, a uniform, a miracle that fit their expectations, until her father gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not dramatic, not proud, but resolute, the kind of nod flight attendants rushed toward her almost instinctively, their professional composure momentarily giving way to alarm as they moved down the aisle with quick, controlled steps, palms raised in gentle caution, because every rule of aviation, every safety protocol, every instinct they had told them that a child standing during a potential emergency was the last thing that should be happening, and one of them knelt slightly to meet the girl at eye level, her voice soft and soothing despite the tension tightening her features. "Sweetheart, please sit down," she whispered, careful not to escalate the situation, careful not to frighten her, as if this were a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved with kindness. But before the girl could respond, her father's voice cut through the growing noise of the cabin, low, steady, and firm in a way that demanded attention without raising volume. "She's trained," he said, each word deliberate, not defensive, not boastful, simply factual, and for a split second the aisle seemed to tilt with the plane itself as those words registered, the murmurs swelling into a wave of disbelief that rolled from one row to the next, people leaning into the aisle to see better, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others letting out short, nervous laughs that carried more fear than humor, phones rising instinctively as cameras began to record, because whatever was happening felt unreal, the kind of moment people feared they would regret not capturing, whispers overlapping, "This can't be real, is this a prank, an 11-year-old, the question echoing again and again, an 11-year-old fighter pilot." And yet, amid the chaos of doubt and speculation, the girl stood quietly, her face untouched by panic or pride, her eyes clear and focused in a way that seemed almost out of place in a cabin full of adults struggling to process what they were witnessing, her gaze lifting briefly toward the front of the plane as another tremor rippled through the fuselage, the turbulence returning with a sudden, uneasy force that sent a collective jolt through the seats, overhead compartments creaking softly, a few passengers crying out as the plane dipped and recovered, and instead of freezing or reaching for support, she adjusted her stance with a subtle shift of her feet, the movement small but confident, as if she were responding to something familiar, and that, more than any explanation, began to change the atmosphere, because people noticed the way she carried herself, not rushed, not hesitant, but measured, like someone who understood the environment she was in, and the flight attendant hesitated, glancing back toward the cockpit door, then at the girl's father, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty, but finding only resolve, and slowly, reluctantly, she stepped aside, creating a narrow path down the aisle, and the girl took it, moving forward with steady steps as the aircraft shuddered again, her hands brushing seatbacks lightly for balance, her head held level despite the motion, and as she passed, conversations fell into hushed tones, disbelief softening into something else, something fragile and unexpected, because fear, when left unanswered, often turns into chaos, but fear paired with purpose can transform into hope. And behind her, as she walked toward the cockpit, that transformation began to ripple outward, passengers lowering their phones slightly, watching with new attention, not just to record but to understand, parents exchanging. Inside the cockpit, chaos flickered in silent signals as warning lights blinked wildly across the instrument panel, screens flashing alerts in urgent colors while soft alarms pulsed beneath the constant roar of the engines, and the air inside felt heavier than the rest of the plane, thick with pressure and responsibility, the captain and first officer moving with practiced urgency yet unmistakable strain etched into their faces, hands adjusting controls that weren't responding the way they should, and when the girl stepped inside, the contrast was startling, her small figure framed by a space built for seasoned professionals, yet she didn't hesitate or shrink under their stares, because while the cockpit was foreign to most, to her it felt familiar in a way she couldn't fully explain, and the captain, wasting no time on disbelief, quickly explained the situation, his voice clipped but clear as he pointed to failing control systems, partial loss of responsiveness, feedback loops not behaving as expected, a scenario that demanded precision and calm under pressure. And as he spoke, the girl listened quietly, not interrupting, her eyes moving deliberately from instrument to instrument, absorbing information with focused intensity, mentally mapping the problem as if assembling a puzzle she had studied before. And when the captain finally paused, expecting questions or hesitation, she simply nodded once and spoke with a confidence that seemed impossibly steady for someone her age. "Let me try," she said, not as a challenge, not as a plea, but as a statement of intent, and for a split second the cockpit fell silent, the kind of silence where doubt and hope collide, before necessity overruled disbelief, and the captain stepped aside just enough to give her access, watching closely, ready to intervene as she adjusted her seat slightly, hands moving with careful precision over the controls, her touch light but certain, and outside the cockpit, minutes stretched endlessly for the passengers, every small vibration magnified by fear, every dip of the wings sending hearts racing, while inside, time seemed to narrow to the rhythm of her breathing and the steady logic guiding her movements. She compensated for the failing systems, rerouted control inputs, adjusted trim and thrust in measured increments, responding to the aircraft's behavior rather than forcing it, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the plane began to respond, the violent shuddering easing into a controlled sway, warning lights stabilizing, alarms falling silent one by one, until the horizon line on the primary display leveled out, steady and calm, and the captain felt it before he fully believed it, the unmistakable sensation of control returning, the aircraft settling into smooth, stable flight. And when he looked at her, truly looked at her, he didn't see a child any more but a pilot, focused, composed, present. And outside the cockpit the change was felt instantly, passengers straightening in their seats as the shaking stopped, confused murmurs giving way to tentative relief, and then realization spread like electricity through the cabin as the plane flew smoothly once more, applause erupting spontaneously, first from a few rows, then swelling into a thunderous wave of clapping, cheers breaking through tears, strangers embracing, parents holding their children tighter not out of fear but gratitude, and flight attendants smiling openly now, eyes shining at they exchanged looks of disbelief and awe, because no one on board would ever forget this flight, not the moment fear gripped them, not the shock of seeing a child walk toward the cockpit, not the surreal calm that followed, and later when the captain made his final announcement, his voice carrying a warmth it hadn't before, thanking everyone for their patience and composure, the cabin